I would like to take this opportunity to invite Madam Rupa Chinay. I would request our scholar to proceed, madam. So, the topic of Vinal Gohai sir is connecting tradition to contemporary livelihood and skill development programs. And the topic of Dr. Siddharth Patilji is a special session about the groundwork issues of Bodoland and the way forward. And this topic is about the development. So with this, I hand over the session to Vinal Gohai.
Good evening. If you are not too tired, we can start talking. Okay, from the stage. And welcome to this, I think, the final session for today. We've got some interesting speakers. One, of course, is Rupert, everyone more journalists. Keeps writing and keeps shocking our conscience, right? Another thing is conscience in after it. An eminent expert in the field of law. Right? So, we're already running here. Can we take about 15 minutes, let's see? Right? That should be all right. Because about 15 minutes each to get around to sharing our thoughts, and then because we can open up the discussion for everyone. Right? We don't want to make it very technical, do we? Right? We want more conversational. I think that's the thing. At the tone we want to get going at this time of day. Because if we get very technical, we fall asleep. Many people have been walking around and you're too tired, but you don't want to keep falling asleep. You want to have fun. So, yeah. Would you want to have a cup of tea here? Yeah. So, who would like to go first? So, yeah, we have this presentation. So, I'm Siddharth, basically based in an organization called Aquatam. Here, invited by the Bharat Rural Banking Foundation, but I represent an organization called Aquatam, which works on groundwater across the Indian subcontinent. So, I'm basically going to be talking a little bit about groundwater in Bodoland. Uh, you know, what is it that we should be looking at when we're looking at developing livelihoods, improving livelihoods, when we're looking at drinking water security? What are the key points related to groundwater that we look at? So, yeah, next. So, if we basically first, I'd just like to establish the groundwater dependence of Bodoland. When you come here, playground of rivers and lots of water. But if you look at drinking water, just click once more, please. Next. Whether it's, first, if we look at irrigation dependence, then the large percentage, almost 90% of the irrigated agriculture in the state. Irrigated agriculture is not too much, but whatever is irrigated, a large part of that is actually based on groundwater. Within groundwater, a large part of the irrigation is coming from tube wells and not from open wells or dug wells. So that's a very interesting change, and I've not put it here, but if you track it across different senses of the minor irrigation schemes, then you'll notice that there is a tendency for haphazard, uncontrolled drilling of tube wells for irrigation, which has begun in Bodoland as well. following the trajectory, similar trajectory which happened in, say, Punjab and Haryana. Yeah. Next. Now, on the other hand, just one thing. If we look at drinking water, then there is a clear dependence on groundwater also. This is based on the census, but if you also look at the national rural drinking water supply schemes, then it is clear that groundwater is almost 90% of drinking water in borderland, in rural as well as urban, is coming from drinking water. Now, all of our censuses in India look, they have a separate section called tap water. Unfortunately, tap is not the resource which supplies water, and in majority cases, tap water is actually also probably coming from groundwater. So if you add to it, 99% of our drinking water is also coming from groundwater. So, given that background, two of the most important aspects of water, irrigation, agricultural livelihoods, and drinking water are almost entirely dependent on groundwater and borderland. Now, a very typical peculiar setting geographically, the previous panel also mentioned this, that you're looking at the Bhutan. Yeah. So we're looking at the Himalayan foothills where the border is international border, the borderland border is actually where the foothills begin. There are a few isolated patches of some terai ranges also in borderland, but it's largely plains. Now, it's actually a playground of rivers, all of them flowing north-south. It's very important to understand a little bit of geomorphology. The distance that these multiple rivers that you're seeing in the map, that they are traveling before they meet the Brahmaputra is not a lot. Now, this is an extremely important point from a morphological perspective because the rainfall in Bhutan is going to be very high. The gradient through which the slope through which the rivers are flowing is going to be very high, and then they suddenly enter the plains, which means this is a highly flood-prone region. Just click once, please. One important aspect of floods, which is not really thoroughly studied in India, is what we call as the typology of floods. We just look at a region as a flood-prone region, but you could have different kinds of floods. You could have your riverine floods, you could have flash floods. We are building a lot of embankments nowadays, so you have floods within embankment, you have floods outside the embankment. How are the floods? And each of this different typology of flood is actually, as a hazard, it's very different, but even as a natural setting, it's very different. So it's important to actually begin looking at these plains from this kind of a perspective. Just click, please. Hello. Next. Yeah. Just once more. So now, again, a similar picture zoomed in, but what's important here is that the Himalayas are about 65 million years old. There's this whole formation of the floodplains, the Indo-Gangetic Brahmaputra floodplains began at around 65 million years. So the evolution of what you see today is that old. Now, what you can see here is the rivers aren't static. They're not canals which will always be the way we are seeing them today. They've been shifting courses. There are abandoned channels, and it's a very complex system. Now, you have what is known as alluvial fans. So the entire borderland is actually made up of a lot of fans. Like again, the previous panel mentioned, a lot of sediment is coming down from the Bhutan Himalaya. When you have rivers shifting course like this on the surface, the whole subsurface that we are looking at is going to be governed by these shifting rivers. So a river floods, it deposits. Next year it floods again, it deposits again. So it's basically, as it's shifting course, its depositional environment is also changing. So next, please. So this is a kind of a, the blue is where the river is flowing today. Yellow is where the river was possibly flowing a couple of million years back, and everything in between is what has happened. Click once more. So if we take a cross section of the subsurface, if we look below the ground, this is how the river has deposited. It's not depositing uniformly. You don't have sand, silt, and clay layers which are uniform across hundreds of kilometers. You have patches where the river is deposited. This is an extremely important point. I actually spoke a lot about surface geomorphology because that is what has influenced the subsurface geology or the subsurface setting of groundwater. Groundwater is found in rocks and rock material, and this rock material in Bodoland is governed by how rivers deposit in these kind of settings. Next. So this is a general hydrogeological map of Bodoland. Hydrogeology is the study of groundwater, and so what I've tried to do is see most of Bodoland is actually yellow, which is the typical alluvial sand, silt, clay kind of a setting. Some patches of pink towards the southwest, and then you have the Bhutan Himalayas. Why is Bhutan Himalayas important in this map? Because the sediments that you are getting in Bodoland have actually come from those Himalayas. So you might have a different kind of storage and all in sand, silt, clay in Bodoland, but that sand, silt, and clay is coming from rocks in Bhutan, and therefore it's important to have that perspective also ready. Next. Just click twice. Once more, yeah. So classical literature, if you look at classical yeah. So alluvial, very high storages. The reason why we went in for the Green Revolution, Punjab, Haryana, even while I was talking to people, I came down yesterday. General perception is infinite water, unlimited water, have schemes. I'm sure government has also looked, government, civil society, support agencies, everyone is looking at a large amount of tube wells, bore wells to give a boost to livelihoods. That's the perception that one gets. And that's in a way true that for the last 65 million years, water's been getting accumulated in these groundwater storages, which is true. But that perspective is important, that it's taken millions of years for it to get saturated. So if we desaturate it in, say, 20, 30 years, it's going to be near impossible to resaturate it over the next, say, 10, 20 years, which is what we are looking at in Punjab, Haryana. So do we want to follow the same trajectory or do we want to take a slightly different perspective is the question that I wanted to raise. Now, this is the standard groundwater assessment map at the national level, assessments done. I'm not questioning the methodology, but I am asking you whether this is the only way to assess vulnerability, that there is no over-exploitation in Bodoland, water levels are very shallow, so a lot of groundwater. But vulnerability is not just quantity, it is also quality. Click once. Some data from other very similar floodplains in Bihar, foothills of Nepal, districts of Pachim Champaran, Madhubani, Saharsa, Supal, which are exactly like Bodoland. Dug wells have contamination, biological contamination. Next, hand pumps, bore wells, tube wells have chemical contamination like arsenic, fluoride, and iron. So, we're looking at vulnerability not just from a quantity perspective, but also a quality perspective. Yes, we have a lot of water, but what is the quality of water that we are looking at in this part of the country? Now, standard data sets right now say Bodoland does not have too many chemical contamination problems, but a final look at those data sets shows yes, there is arsenic and iron, but it's not yet up to the limits at which you start panicking. Which is why the map looks white, and which is why the sediments in Bhutan, the rocks in Bhutan are important. Those rocks release arsenic, iron, and fluoride. So eventually, if we continue, unmanaged, unplanned kind of groundwater exploitation, we are going to be facing similar problems. So one part is the contamination part when you don't have floods, but you also have a flood issue in Bodoland. And what is it? What are we looking at from a vulnerability perspective during those 4 months of flooding? I mean, relief is one part, but what about resilience to floods from a drinking water perspective? Next. Now, groundwater is always looked at from this perspective. You're looking at wells, you're looking at springs, you're looking at bore wells, hand pumps, tube wells, but these are sources. Next, that is not the resource. When it comes to groundwater, the resource is basically what is known as an aquifer. You know, Hindi we call it Bhujal Dharak or Jal Dharak. It's a formation of rock or rock material that holds water. So the whole perspective on groundwater needs to shift from borewells and springs or duggles to aquifers. Talk about the resource, don't talk about the sources. And unless we don't do that, unless we start considering groundwater as a common pool resource, we really cannot tackle these problems. And the whole development, trajectory of our country is geared towards more individualistic, more private sources of groundwater to improve livelihoods, rather than looking at community-based, access to groundwater, management of groundwater. So, eventually even Bodoland is going to have tens of millions of groundwater sources, private sources, and then managing it is going to be, almost impossible, just like the other parts of the country. So can we look at a different paradigm immediately right now? So that's basically what I was going to try. Just click once more. This is what you had in the rest of the country, where you had a few wells, community-based wells, community-managed wells, festivals which was celebrated around duck wells and springs, and then eventually we went down to private sources such as handworks, which you're seeing all over Bodoland. Those India Mark II, which has now been जुगाड़ करके उसको Indian बनाया. Now you can put it in 5,000 and 6,000 rupees, any person. Made of pig iron, rusty heads, leaky heads, and all kinds. So eventually, private access leading to contamination also, and not just biological contamination, mind you. It's also arsenic and fluoride. So next. Now, classic case, again I'm putting this image because, yeah, okay, it's okay. If you look at the literature around arsenic mobilization, how does arsenic come into groundwater? And we are in a part which is known for it. Bangladesh is a very strong case study on arsenic. Bihar also. Classical literature of India always thought that arsenic is south of Bihar, south of Brahmaputra, Vagera. Now it's emerging everywhere. Literature tells us when does arsenic get released in water, where does it get released. This is the best typical setting for arsenic, which is floodplains with sediments coming from the Himalayas which have arsenic, where groundwater moves very slowly, where once you start taking water from deeper aquifers, deeper groundwater, where oxidation is not possible, that's where you're going to get arsenic. So a shift from open wells to hand pumps is when you start getting more and more arsenic. Arsenic, iron, fluoride. There is clear data now where well-maintained, regularly used shallow wells, open wells, do not show the presence of iron, arsenic, or fluoride, whereas borewells and tube wells do show, neighboring duggles and tube wells have started to show these differences. Next. So that's exactly what I'm saying. It's the sediments that you're sitting on here have arsenic and fluoride, but it's not just about that. It's also about how you access groundwater. Shallow groundwater of clean, regularly maintained duckwells will not show arsenic ions simply because of the natural oxidation process. Whereas deeper groundwater is going to show that. So this whole, this is the paradox of groundwater quality. Biological contamination is omnipresent. It's there. It's everywhere. We know that across India. You are going to get chemical contamination in deeper, reducing conditions of groundwater. Which one is easier to treat, which one is easier to manage is the question that we need to answer and promote as part of our policies. Next. Yeah, biggest question. We know sanitation schemes have been going on since the last 2 decades now, I think. You had Nirmal Bharat Abhiyan, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, Total Sanitation Campaign, uske pehle bhi kuch hua hoga, I don't remember. But the whole model of sanitation we are promoting is doing soap pits. Soap pit works on the whole principle that moisture seeps out and the solid waste can then decompose quickly. In Bodoland, your water table is shallow. It's so shallow that I was told many places you can still dig by hand and get groundwater. In that kind of a setting, your sanitation design cannot be a soak pit model because if your soil is filled with moisture, nothing is going to soak out. and you're actually going to contaminate. So groundwater is both the source and the sink when it comes to Indian rural, especially rural habitations. But whatever urban I've been looking at, even in urban in Bodoland, groundwater is your source for drinking, for irrigation, and it is also the sink for all your waste. So sanitation is definitely something you're going to have to look at. Next. A very important point, river rejuvenation is a very big thing in India nowadays. Hardly any mention of groundwater when it comes to river rejuvenation. International Water Management Institute, IWMI, has come out with several reports on the big rivers of the Hindu Kush Himalayas, and they have clearly said snow melt contributes less than 5% to the flow of all the five Hindu Kush Himalayan rivers. 5%, less than 5%. Whether it's the Ganga, the Indus, the Brahmaputra. All our climate change talk is around glaciers, which contribute less than 5% to our rivers. Groundwater contributes between 18 to 20% to these same rivers, and we do not talk of groundwater. We do not look at groundwater as a service provider for ecosystems. Not just ecosystems, cultural services. So much of our culture is around rivers. Groundwater is providing that very important aspect as it is a service provider and we are not looking at it. So, our national parks, our ecosystems, our cultural, services, that is one aspect of groundwater which is completely ignored, and we are just looking at it like a good to be exploited for livelihoods and drinking water. Next. So basically, just trying to summarize, what I'm trying to get to here is, groundwater governance and management. So as an organization, we are promoting this. The first and foremost is that groundwater is a common pool resource. And therefore, how do we not promote individual, atomistic, private groundwater schemes and move towards more community-based, group-based schemes that can be managed better? So, principles, it has to be at a common pool resource perspective. People, human behavior is very important. Tensions, conflicts. If your agriculture and drinking water is completely dependent on the same resource, there is an inherent hidden competition already happening which we don't understand. The same person's drinking water is competing with that farmer's irrigation requirement. So there is that competition which is not visible but it's happening. And eventually conflicts as they have arisen in other parts have begun. Processes has to be collaborative and participative. Data has to be built and analyzed, presented at the community level, which gram panchayats in villages, boards in urban settlements, practices community-based. I mean, finally the action has to be at the community level and policies. I mean, most important when it comes to policy is that stop looking at it as the top-down approach has not worked in India when it comes to groundwater. It will not work anywhere. It has to be, the top can make broad policies, but the main governance and management framework has to be at the local level. One. Second, nobody owns groundwater, not even the government. So when we talk about having strong regulation, we are basically saying government should regulate groundwater as almost like an owner of groundwater. But what we are saying is that you really can't own that resource. No one can. The government has to act like a public trustee of groundwater and govern it as a trust and not as an owner. So this top-down command and control kind of approach has not worked on groundwater anywhere in the world. The only approaches which have worked is, what we call as participatory groundwater management and governance. Yeah. And is here, just one sheet, which is basically plurality and partnership. So, the BRLF, the Ushar Mukti model that we saw, that's exactly what we are also saying, that community-based organizations, CSOs, and the government have to come together to do something like this. It's a very utopian kind of a situation to imagine at the moment, but it's not impossible. Where we look at a groundwater management framework or a water management framework at the Gram Panchayat level, where you have skilled, trained people based in the Gram Panchayat to collect, analyze, and take decisions based on data on water resources, especially on groundwater. Yeah, thank you.
Greetings. I have been a witness to the Bodoland story for at least 4 decades. I first came to these parts in 1983, at a time when most people in the rest of India had never heard about the Bodos. Since that time, I have watched the enormous struggle of the Bodo people to survive economically, to retain their land, language, political identity. These decades have seen horrific violence, internal divisions, and hardship for those who live here. But today, finally, I feel there is hope. After decades of bitter struggle, the attainment of the sixth schedule of the Constitution, finally achieved in 2003, enables communities to ensure control of their land, natural resources, and way of life. With a new generation of leaders, Bodo society can finally hope to experience peace, manage their own affairs, and forge their own destiny. The key question now is, can the communities of Bodo land develop a master plan for their own development? The special protection under 6th Schedule and Article 371 series assured to the Northeast tribes by the Indian Constitution is a hard-won right, fought for by the tribal leaders that no one else in the rest of India has. Can the people of Bodoland honor the trust that was placed in them? Will they protect this land and its rich biodiversity so that future generations have the means to survive with clean air, water, nutritious food, livelihood, and well-being? While many of the younger generation of Bodos are seeking a higher education and better livelihood opportunities, it is this group that will be the driving force for a new Bodoland. With their exposure to a wider world, access to information, they can play a role in ensuring that knowledge and ideas filter down to every level of society and facilitate dialogue. This will help communities and their leaders to make informed decisions that seek the best interest of all who live here. According to economist Raghuram Rajan, World Economic History speaks of the vital involvement of communities in the development dialogue. This involvement corrects the imbalance of the state and the market. Studies in public policy further underline that when policy makers listen to the voices of the most marginalized segment within a community, they are best placed to understand how and why policies have gone wrong. This understanding helps leaders to make workable plans that ensure implementation of development plans with equity and justice. The Northeast region today faces many challenges. Hurtling towards you are plans to extract the natural resources and achieve the government's goal of a $5 trillion economy. This will see transformation of tribal lands into monoculture, cash crop plantation that yield a gold mine of profit in a short space of time. But if hitting a gold mine by a few will destroy your golden environment with its forests, water, biodiversity, then it will be counter to the struggle of survival by the Bodo people. Your communities and leaders have to be wise in choosing which way is true survival. It is vital, therefore, that we give ourselves the time to draw upon collective wisdom and have the confidence to chart your own course. We in the rest of India have lost our way in the mad rush to get rich quick at any cost. Today, in cities like Mumbai, where I live, material advancement is also bringing pollution and poisoned air. Our children and the elderly are paying a severe price with their health. While government and commercial interests in the rest of India has wiped out its forest cover and natural resources, the Northeast tribes have honored the trust placed in them by India's constitution and protected the land and its biodiversity. Today, we all have to come back to that wisdom and lifestyle for our own survival. One development idea currently receiving a lot of attention from the central government and private agencies is a massive effort to promote palm oil cultivation in India. The 2021 Union Cabinet, in 2021, the Union Cabinet allocated over 11,040 crores through the National Mission on Edible Oil Palm, with a special focus on Northeast region and Andaman and Nicobar Islands. It targets a land area about 3.5 times the size of Goa. Northeast farmers are being lured with breathtaking promises of government subsidy, infrastructure, and price support. Through private corporations, Northeast farmers will get access to India's domestic market that presently imports 99% of its palm oil needs from Malaysia and Indonesia. There is the promise of hitting a gold mine of profits. Several Northeast states are now committed to promoting this plan and assign memorandums of understanding, the latest being Nagaland. Many Northeast farmers are plunging into palm oil cultivation without knowing what can go irreversibly wrong. Neither are they aware of alternative livelihood programs that might be available through existing government programs and subsidies, which nobody talks about in the push to promote specific agendas and plans. According to independent conservation scientists and researchers in India that I've been interacting with in the last couple of weeks, there are a number of compelling reasons why the Northeast and Andaman and Nicobar Islands will not be a suitable place for palm oil cultivation. This region encompasses 3 global biodiversity hotspots that are crucial to the protection of the planet's gene pool. These hotspots, the Himalayan belt, which includes the Northeast and Myanmar plains, Andaman and Nicobar and Western Ghats, are home to a multitude of globally threatened species of animals, insects, birds, medicinal plants, wild vegetables, fruits and grains that are endemic only to these specific areas. While the Northeast continues to retain sizable tracts of natural forests still left in India, it is difficult to conceive the entry of palm oil plantations without the cutting down and replacing of these existing forests. Such forests provide climate resilience, support indigenous cultures and livelihoods. Maps of Food and Agriculture Organization show that most areas of the Northeast are not climatically suitable for oil palm cultivation. Meanwhile, there is compelling evidence emerging from Mizoram, which launched into palm oil cultivation since 2004. It presents an important case study on what can go wrong. Mizo journalist Kimi Kohli's investigative article in the Caravan magazine documents evidence showing how a decade are forced to sell their land due to zero profit in palm oil plantation. Their soil has lost its fertility. Palm oil plantations are a failure and have led to impoverished farmers and unaccountable companies. The following are some key points to show what went wrong in Mizoram and why palm plantations in the northeast will fail. The sloping topography of Mizoram is a major constraint for palm oil cultivation. The soil is soft and loss of rich, dense natural forest cover has led to soil erosion and poor water retention. This is true of northeastern areas too. Oil palm oil is an extremely thirsty crop. Each plant needs 300 liters of water per day. Where is this water to come from in the northeast, which is highly dependent on monsoon rains and is devoid of irrigation infrastructure? Northeast farmers need all the information related to crop viability and potential yields in their region. They need to know about oil palm's tremendous need for irrigation and chemical inputs. Mizoram streams and rivers that supported downstream paddy cultivation have long been dry. Monoculture crop cannot hold water in soil or absorb rainwater. Groundwater recharge is affected. Crucially linked to groundwater absorption and balanced flow is the presence of natural forests and habitats which are still intact in the northeast. They provide a crucial buffer against the impact of climate change on India, which will see increasing events such as superstorm cyclones, massive floods, and severe droughts. Scientists say we will need all the forests and natural habitat we have to buffer us against such extreme events. Forests soak up extreme rainfall and prevent floods, and then release water throughout the year to prevent droughts. Oil palm plantation has eaten into Mizoram's natural forest cover. Despite tall promises of the government, Mizoram continues to suffer absence of basic infrastructure like interior road connectivity, transportation, cold storage, warehousing, or irrigation facilities. The government said palm oil cannot be planted in any place higher than 900 meters above sea level. Despite that, the government has encouraged and given massive subsidies even in remote, inaccessible areas, with the assurance that companies are going to be legally bound to buy the farmers' produce. Companies reneged on this, blaming their non-performance on poor infrastructure, or they've not responded at all. It is to be noted that unlike other oil or plantation crops, freshly harvested bunches of oil palm fruit have to be processed within 24 hours or the oil is unsuitable for use. Milling facility and road connection has to be close to the plantation. Such infrastructure is non-existent in the northeast. Monoculture plantations are completely devoid of biodiversity. In Mizoram, palm oil cultivation shows there are no birds or insects. Nearby fruit trees, like lemon or pineapple, don't produce fruit anymore. It is very hard to uproot the palm oil plant and replace it with other crops. Jute cultivation in the northeast is being severely castigated by many agencies as unscientific and is blamed for the loss of the natural forest cover. Branded as wasteland, jute fields in fact provide a range of food and non-food crops like timber, bamboo, medicinal plants to tribal communities. The plan to replace jute with plantations denies communities the agency to manage their lands. It reduces June cultivators to plantation labor. Such shifts in land ownership patterns from community-owned tribal lands to controlled by private companies will drastically change the hard-won constitutional protection of the Northeast tribal groups. Such shift in land ownership, loss of biodiversity and forest cover, soil fertility have already happened in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. It will be a tragedy of great proportion if we do not pay attention to these well-documented experiences of Mizoram and Southeast Asian countries and repeat their mistakes. A fundamental concern is that with the entry of palm oil in the Northeast, communities will risk an imbalance in local food security and lose the independence to shape their own future. I believe this knowledge festival launched by Bodoland Administration and University is a crucial step forward in the development story of Bodoland. It can help create space for partnerships with people in the rest of India, people who know a lot about this subject and have studied it. It can enable transfer of knowledge and experience about what can go wrong. It can also help us find viable and balanced alternatives for livelihood and biodiversity protection. It can enable communities and their leaders to write their own master plan for development that is based on an understanding of what works best for the common people of this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat. Very nice. Good to have someone who has been visiting the region and keeping an eye on it for a very long time, since the 1980s, that's the time that Assam education started at quarterly education. It's fantastic, and then, getting an eye on it, the perspective that comes, in a way, the insider, outsider, right, who offers you a different perspective from the one that people sometimes inside miss out. Right? With the license that can criticize the Northeast, the movement, various movements in it, said this is where you guys are perhaps going wrong. This is what you really need to think about. There were a lot of other speakers, but unfortunately, I think I'll have to sum it up. I think people have to come. So I have to share my thoughts. I was not intending. I thought I was just a chair and I could be lazy and sit down and comment on what other people have spoken about. But allow me to kind of share some of my thoughts because it's part of the larger conversation. I think we are at a very critical time. Yeah, that us, depending on if you are geologist, like Mr. Patil, you'll be saying that we have been watershed perhaps of change. Climate change is so obvious here. In the last few years, anyone who lives in the Northeast has seen these episodes of very extreme flooding. It's always been flooded, but the kind of flooding that we have had in recent years, I think, has been amazing. Last year, for instance, I worked with a humanitarian organization, and we were shocked by the scale of flooding that we have had. There was the Dimahasal district, a hilly district, a mountainous district, where large villages were washed away. People's farmlands were washed away. And then you had, 10 feet of water, 15 feet of water downstream, right? Water, people, there's a district called Morrigaon, where the deputy commissioner happened to be a friend of mine, and we were having this conversation as I was passing through it. And I was saying that seems all the people in your district are now living in the streets, in the roads. And he was having a laugh and said, yeah, that's what's happening. It's tragic. It's tragic that such things are happening, and we seem to have so little control over what we can do. Well, that's a change, but maybe perhaps at this point of time, as we get down to having this conversation as we are today, you get to having these conversations with a lot of other people as well, because I think in the last month I've attended, I think, at least 4 or 5 discussions, conversations on climate change, climate change, biodiversity, and everywhere you go, you hear a lot of this. It's not just people in civil society where this sort of talk about problems, but it's also among people in the government, political groups, and increasingly, I think this is becoming a juncture where we are beginning to, question the kind of development that we have in our region as well. Of course, you can't confine many of these things just to the region, but that's the best that we can do. Start talking about the region first, and then try to go beyond. And this is where, we have been thinking about the group I has alluded to it. I think Dr. Patel as well, in one way or the other. But the kind of development that we have been seeing in the northeast, and this is our question to the Borderland government as well. What is the imagination? What's your perspective? How are you looking at development here? Is it more dams? Is it more infrastructure like big roads and railways, faster railway? Or, more energy plants coming up here? We have one in the neighborhood. A few more perhaps with dams. The dams are really not very far in Bhutan. Bhutan is just a yawn away. So is that it or what? This place once, where we are sitting right now, had 100 feet tall, sal trees, ironwood trees. Anyone who's from here would nod their heads, right? 100 foot. And you could walk into these forests and you see that the forest floor would be damp, it would be wet. Then around 1993, I happened to be working in these places, 92, 93, 94. That's when, the forest started getting destroyed. There are two kinds of forests there. You had plantations, or ironwood plantations to make the sleepers of the railways, and you've also had the forests, your core areas which are relatively undisturbed, that kind of continuity with the town. Fantastic forests, you could walk in the day and see the sunlight and see a green haze above you. Those are the kind of forests that we had. They're all gone. And we can't get into why they were all gone. We can criticize the government, of course, whichever government was there at that point in time. We can really try to analyze it in depth. But we also need to try to understand where it comes from. Essentially, it comes from the kind of development dream that we have been selling to people and selling ourselves, without trying to understand how far that kind of development perspective would really take us, a growth-oriented development perspective, right? Where it's all about taking resources, extract. Well-being is a word that is just lost to us. Even when we engage, when politicians engage, officials engage, people in civil societies engage with people, it's about it's about buildings, it's about cars, it's about infrastructure, it's about energy, right? Somehow the conversation is veered away. The idea is that you get rich, the rich will get rich, and somehow it will percolate down to everyone else. I think these are common refrains that you hear everywhere. The idea of well-being that was perhaps talked about once at one point in time has been pushed aside, it's been laid aside. If you're looking at, and that's what I was primarily supposed to speak about today, and I'm getting to that now, is that even if you're looking at the skills programs that we have, the government of India is spending huge amounts of money on skills. All this, it's coming to the states, it's coming to, I'm sure part of it's also coming to the Bikf Holl and territorial government. Skills, money for skills. Why? Because we want to be another China, perhaps, or we want to, do something else, and we want to get down into production. Production leads into fantastic kind of growth. But is it what we really need? Have we really thought about, how people here really take it? I've been looking at some of the programs. This is something that's been going on for about 4 or 5 years, particularly. It's been taking steam the last 4 or 5 years. And you go and try to look at the livelihood skills programs that they have. So there's more plumbing, there's more of, electrician, turning people into electricians. There's more people using latch machines, machinists, right? But have we really attempted to kind of analyze what we really need to do from the perspective of people on the ground? When you're looking at traditional communities, what did people in our parts do? Right? It could have a mix of different things. Of course, we would say like we were fairly autonomous, villages, right, or habitations where anything between 200 to 500 families, even larger communities could be living. And we had everything. We had a blacksmith, however isolated they may have been in Arunachal, Nagaland, and Manipur, even Assam. You had the blacksmiths, you had your potters, you had your farmers, you had your hunters. I'm not saying we need to be that sentimental and go back to that time. But that should tell us a story that many of those skills that were there in people, that our people had, the kind of economy we had constructed around us, has over the last, 7, 8 decades of Indian independence actually been fallen aside. You still have bits and pieces of them, you perhaps still have bits and pieces of them, but most of it is gone. We have tried, somehow our economies have got lopsided. Let me give an example to kind of illustrate what I'm saying. There's a community in Assam known as the Hira community. They make pots, particularly they used to make the cooking pots. You could cook on them, right? And they'll shape this. They won't use the potter's wheel. They'll shape them with their hand. They use a particular kind of clay, and they were really good at it. And when the product comes out, you'll be surprised it's made by hand. They shape it by hand, right? And they were fairly prosperous till about the 1970s. Not prosperous, but they were at a certain standard of a level of well-being. But then suddenly, the India-Bangladesh border, perhaps because of the agitation here, became a hard border. It became hard because they used to sell a lot of stuff in Bangladesh or even West Bengal. They used to go down, and Bengali widows, in particularly, would cook their food in those earthen vessels. But it became a hard border. It stopped, and that's when their trade started falling apart. Now, what for that matter, if you're looking at, Assam and all these communities of bell metal, blacksmithing, very useful people. They used to fix everything for us, whether it was making a plows or, make a knife, make a machete, anything that you needed to use a scythe in the fields, that was being made by these communities. And they were pretty good at that. Right? And they were very suitable to the kind of life we eat, the kind of things that we cultivate, our betel nuts, areca leaves, or the rice that we grow, the crops that we grow, different kind of vegetables we grow, very suitable. But now, over time, they disappear. There's barely 10% of them doing it now. And I wonder why. And I've been asking these people, what's happened to the Hira community, the potters? What's happened to the blacksmiths? Why have they gone? They're usually very poor because, over time, that's what they used to do. That's what the blacksmithy of, doing their ceramic work. They never owned land. They are not farmers. But, the answer is not really very difficult to find. You suddenly have a lot of cheap stuff coming in. You have plastics coming in. You have aluminium vessels coming in, right? A different kind of economy started coming in. And there were very few checks and balances to that. So eventually, the stuff that came in from outside started, killing the local economy that exists. It's a bit like what we argue in the WTO meetings, World Trade Organization meeting, and we say like, we should get rid of trade barriers. Countries like India or even the US, for instance, like trade barriers because you want to protect your farmers, you want to protect your industries. But you don't have that within India. You don't have those kind of policies that are specific to states or specific to regions. Consequently, you're not able to compete with when they're the better funded, better resourced industries of the other part, perhaps better mechanized industries. So some of us have been saying, and this is something that's emerging in a lot of the conversations, is that more than plumbers and electricians, we just need to create that space for our blacksmiths, for our potters, for our coppersmiths. Just open it up. They need a little bit of equipment, right? Modernization doesn't mean a whole lot of different things, It just means small things, small changes. The amount of resources that are necessary to make the change. That's the kind of change we want. On the contrary, what has happened is that we have had something like the Green Revolution arriving in Assam, for instance. Assam in the 60s, in the 50s and the 60s were the second largest economy in the country after the Bombay Presidency. It was the second largest SDD, state domestic product. What happened? But now it imports a lot of stuff. It's one of the weakest in the country. What happened to perhaps the largest rice growing region? It's not just rice, it was also potatoes and other stuff that used to go from here, exported from here, the surplus. What happened? How did it collapse? It's largely because of, I think, the failure of the governments, the academics of the region to understand that this outflow is being caused by the fact that, there are forces. There is government policy, our forces larger than, we are, that need to control what we are doing. We need to protect ourselves. We have, in the meantime, of course, arrived at Green Revolution rather late. And what is being forced down on us is a lot of pesticides, more of groundwater use, where we, as you would have said, do we really need that kind of groundwater use out here? Or if we are, what are the sustainable ways of doing using groundwater? Without getting that kind of an analysis into place, I think we're going to fail. Our proposition is that there is a lot of local knowledge, and local knowledge is contextual knowledge. It's from the farming communities, it's from the weaving communities. We need to bring this all in. This conversation can go on. I can talk about handloom, I can talk about silk. All of these have really suffered. We really need to pick them up, not turn our people into plumbers and electricians, not turn them into labor that can be sent off to work as cheap labor in Delhi or Faridabad or some other place. Right? They need to be retained here. They need to be brought in. They need to be empowered with a lot of support and a certain amount of wisdom. I think that wisdom can come if we can create quality, which looks first into understanding, analyzing where we are, and then trying to perhaps persuade everyone concerned, persuade all the stakeholders to do the right things. There's a lot of sense that the previous two speakers, Dr. Patel and Rupa Chennai, spoke about. I think we need to incorporate that. I'm not talking about a certain kind of insularity we sometimes tend to kind of fall into. Right? There is this defensiveness in people in the Northeast. We tend to become very insular. I'm not talking about that insularity. But we need to get an internal conversation going and see and understand what's best for us. Or we will suffer from an internal colonialism that has been going on for a long time. Neocolonialism for India is different. Neocolonialism for the Northeast is 2 times deeper. It's more intense. And this is what we perhaps need to break out from. Our skills program has got to be devised here. Skills program from understanding the requirements of this place, right? And also understanding our international neighborhood. Right? Do we want this place to be just a corridor or a place where cheap labor is available between 2 juggernauts of China and Southeast Asia and India, the rest of India? Or we want to be this space which is also looking after its own requirements, its own necessities. Well, I suppose that's the kind of. I think this could be one more of those beginnings that we really need. We need to connect. We need to talk. We need to get this conversation going. And thank you, Rupa, Chennai, and Patel. It's interesting to hear from you. We're really opening it up because this is supposed to be a conversation. We're just taking slices of it and we're opening up to talk with you. So, any of you have any questions or your opinions? Please. We don't have too much time. It's getting dark outside, but whatever. Please.
You want to ask something? Yeah. Should I just say? Yeah.
Thank you very much for what you both said and for all 3 of you. I guess the question is, all 3 of you talked about the need for local communities to be making decisions, to be informed. Are there many, and for contextualized information, are there many networks or platforms where local communities are engaging around these issues of groundwater and palm oil coming in. Like, do they engage as a political force in responding to some of these needs? I guess, where is that happening? How does it happen?
I think I just want to talk about the rest of India, um, who are really thinking about these issues in the Northeast. And I have been interacting with them over the last couple of weeks because I wanted to understand about this palm oil issue and the implications for the Northeast. And I was very interested to these are names that are highly respected in India, in the scientific circles and conservation circles. And they have campaigned for a long time on these issues uh, uh, for the three hot biodiversity zones I was talking about. Now, the interesting thing is that where this palm oil issue is concerned, they've been giving, there's a massive information that is available. And I've been sharing that with all my Northeast friends. But, when you see so many articles, it's very difficult to um, absorb the key points. So, one of the things we have been trying to do is create a brief for community leaders. Now, we're also trying to understand the issue and we don't have all the answers. So, what we've done so far is written down the points that I shared today, which is the downside of palm oil cultivation. But we need to look at the laws, we need to look at the biodiversity laws, we need to look at government programs and what are the alternatives. So that is something where I feel having this link with people in the rest of India would be very important. Um, you're getting on board very big names.
What the?
So it's a Mumbai pollution problem that I'm handling. One more point I just want to make. Expertise exists in the Northeast itself. There are people here who I have interacted with who really know their subject, who know this area, and have worked for years in understanding what is the reality. And therefore, what support we, the rest of India, can give them, I think that will be crucial, and that is something that uh, specific people in the rest of India are willing to come and share their knowledge, their experience. But the initiative has to come from the Northeast. So, yes, there are other communities in the Northeast who are also talking about this in Nagaland. But very little time because the government is pushing massively for it, for palm oil. So, that's why I really came specifically to talk about this because you have a very small window that is open to you to convince your own community about what is the best, what is all sides of the information so that you can make informed choices.
I just split it into traditional systems and what we have today. Traditionally, large parts of India have had community-based water management, very well documented. If you look at Center for Science website, rainwaterharvesting.org, they documented hundreds of traditional water harvesting and management technologies across India. We had sacred groves, which, unfortunately the focus is always around the trees, but it's actually a water management system. If you come to Maharashtra, I'm sure in large parts of Northeast also, it's a spring which is being protected through a religious cultural system. One example which we always give is the Shiva temple. Every important river in India, the source now has a Shiva temple, which is giving importance to that spring, which is so. There are a lot of such traditional uh, water management systems. In fact, in Nepal and bordering parts, uh, there are also caste and class issues around this. So, who maintains the spring? Who owns the land of the spring? All of this was well defined in the communities. Today, when I am talking about community-based water management, I'm talking about it in an administrative setup of the country because that's what we have to work with. I don't agree with. It's not that I don't agree with it. It's difficult, natural, and admin boundaries don't match. But we have to work with what it is. So a gram panchayat is the kind of community I'm talking about. Now, I also don't think civil society can always exit. That's another issue. So when I say communities should be able to manage their own water, I mean that there will always be some external support required, some facilitative support from scientists, from academics, from different kind of people, but who need to be able to, tell the Gram Panchayat on how the data has to be generated, what is the data saying, but then the final decision has to flow through the Gram Panchayat. And now the panchayats and the urban boards are empowered enough to take these decisions. It's just that there's a lack of the data on which they have to take decisions, number one. And number two, there is a massive issue with panchayats themselves knowing their own powers. So it's there, the setup is there. It's just about how you push it to start making. So there are examples, the old one, the Coca-Cola versus the Gram Panchayat of Lachipara, classic example. That's not the only example. There are many such examples where communities, as a Gram Panchayat, have been able to manage their own water resources.
Just to add my 2 cents to it, I also think it's about cultures, right? I think over time, over the last few decades, we have created a culture of engagement between people and governments and companies, which doesn't allow for that to happen. Where the views of people, the knowledge of people, the local knowledge, the traditional knowledge, meaning a separation between traditional knowledge and local knowledge. Local knowledge could be like, how a river is behaving now, right? Whether it's what is the tendency of the river in the last 10 years. Whereas a traditional knowledge would be like, how do we deal with flooding, for instance, or maybe water channel. It's a sort of difference that we can get nuanced difference that we can get. It's also about how governments have become patrons. It's a patron-client relationship where you're telling people what to do. You're not listening to people. You're not engaging in people. I think the structures that we have created, the structures of governance that we have created, whether they're panchayats, or whether they're village development committees, or village education committees, or anything else, right? So the way we have structured them in recent times is always top down, right? It's not conversational. It's not a flow. If at all you're asking them for information, get me this data, right? Give me these numbers, right? It's not so much about listening to them. I think that's a culture. That's a way of working that we've developed. And in that complexity, we have got in, political parties who sort of become intermediaries between, communities and the government. And that too is not a very easy relationship. I think, to answer your question, those spaces are perhaps only there with civil society. So civil societies are credited for. But I think there's a gap. We work in that sector. We feel that there's a lot more that civil societies need to be supported with, in terms of building capacities, another ugly word, building someone else's capacity. But I suppose you understand what I mean. Helping people articulate themselves better, understand their issues, creating those conversational, those grounds where we can talk and understand from each other. I think these are also structural issues that come in the way. So, so it's important, I think, for that conversation between academics, government, and people to be happening along with civil societies. At this moment, though, I feel that there's a lot of opening up. The thing that Rupa mentioned at first. That at this junction, perhaps won't last. This small window may get closed again. But there seems to be a small window where people are kind of preparing to have a conversation. We have to seize the moment to get that conversation. But anyone else? Otherwise, it's 6:10. We can close the session. I'm just going to wait for 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a very. Um, I thank all the speakers, Shri Minal Gohai, Dr. Patil, and Madam Rupa Chinai. Just I wanted to add some points. For example, when we talk about water conservation, a few days back I saw something harvesting of water from humid air. Like there are certain devices where the air is bit humid. There is a solar turbine kind of thing, and there's a fan, and that will press the air beneath, and there is a pole which will be some 2 to 3 feet below the ground, and the water automatically condenses there. So some companies like Water Seed, they did that in some places in Africa, kind of. So you can the thermos, you can press it and you can take out the water that has been harvested from the moist air around. This is one thing. The other thing is when we say about conservation of water, maybe we need to put more thoughts on crop diversification. Means, for example, we compare two crops. I take example like this paddy cultivation. We say 1 kilo of paddy which we take, behind that almost 1000 liters of water is being used, comparing to mushroom cultivation, where only 19 liters of water is being used. So certain kind of things maybe we need to be more, we need to discuss more, and then the policy making from government side. But for example, we have been knowing that mushrooms are a superfood, but then like recently it has been implemented in the midday meal. That is because of a policy kind of documents which came up in 2028, where there was a request from Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare to use mushroom and honey in the midday meal. So kind of small policy making from government. Because if I say to the office of deputy commissioner that mushrooms are very good and you kind of, so they will not. Bit of policy making also would be helpful. So yeah. So thank you for have a patient listening to the speakers, and we are almost like 10 minutes late of our session, so we started late. So thank you once again, dear speakers and dear audience. Thank you.